Inner Steel. Marcus Aurelius Meditation Quotes. The Secret Journals of the Philosopher Emperor. Cold open. He was the most powerful man alive. He commanded legions. He ruled an empire that stretched from the deserts of Arabia to the forests of Britain. He had every comfort, every luxury, every pleasure the ancient world could offer, and he rejected almost all of it. Every morning before the sun rose over Rome, Marcus Aurelius sat alone with a candle and a journal. Not to record victories. Not to plan conquests. But to remind himself, quietly, privately, who he was supposed to be. What he wrote in that journal were not speeches for the public. They were not philosophy for students. They were arguments with himself. Warnings to himself. Commands to himself. He called the collection Meditations, and he never intended for anyone to read it. That's what makes it the most honest book ever written. Nearly 2,000 years later, his words sit at the center of how the strongest minds in the world operate. CEOs read him before board meetings. Soldiers carry his words into combat. Athletes recite his lines before competition. And men who are quietly trying to become better, men like the ones who follow Inner Steel, return to him again and again, because something in his words refuses to go stale. In this video, we are going inside 11 of the most powerful quotes Marcus Aurelius ever wrote. Not as philosophy students. Not as historians. As men who are trying to build something real inside themselves. Each quote is paired with a story, because that is how the Stoics themselves taught. Not through abstract theory. Through the weight of lived experience. Let's begin. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. In 1944, a freight train pulled into Auschwitz carrying a Viennese psychiatrist named Viktor Frankl. The guards stripped him of his coat, his manuscript, his wedding ring. They tattooed a number onto his arm and erased his name. For the next 3 years, Frankl lived in conditions that were designed, with deliberate precision, to destroy the human spirit entirely. He watched men who had been physically stronger than him collapse within weeks. He watched men who had been brilliant, accomplished, decorated, crumble like paper in rain. And he noticed something that would change his life and eventually change psychology itself. The men who survived longest were not the strongest. They were the ones who had found something they could still control. Frankl decided, inside a death camp, surrounded by disease, starvation, and daily execution, that no one could take his inner life from him. His captors controlled his body. They controlled his food, his movement, his sleep, his surroundings. But they could not reach the space between stimulus and response. That space, however narrow it had become, still belonged to him. Marcus Aurelius wrote this quote not from a concentration camp but from a military command tent somewhere on the frozen Danube frontier, fighting a war he had not asked for. His health was deteriorating. His generals were dying. The empire he had inherited was slowly fracturing. And like Frankl, he had to keep reminding himself of the only truth that held steady under pressure: you cannot control what happens. You can only control what you do with it. This is the foundation of everything Stoic. Not detachment. Not indifference. Precision. Knowing which battles are yours to fight and which ones will only exhaust you. The man who rages at traffic, at weather, at the opinions of people who don't matter, he wastes the very energy he needs for the battles that are actually his. The strongest men you will ever meet are not the ones who control everything around them. They are the ones who have decided, firmly and permanently, that their inner world is the only territory that cannot be taken. If something in this resonates with you, you are exactly the kind of person Inner Steel was built for. Subscribe. There is much more ahead. The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. In 1914, Ernest Shackleton's ship Endurance became locked in Antarctic pack ice before his crew ever set foot on the continent they had come to cross. The ship was crushed. It sank. 27 men were stranded on floating ice with no radio contact, no rescue plan, and no guarantee of survival. Any rational analysis of the situation produced one conclusion: they were probably going to die. The original mission was not just failed, It was gone. The ship was gone. And yet Shackleton did not collapse into that reality. He picked up the obstacle itself and made it the mission. The new goal was no longer to cross Antarctica. The new goal was to keep 27 men alive until rescue was possible. He launched 3 small lifeboats across 600 miles of the most violent ocean on Earth. He sailed in near constant darkness, in storms that should have swallowed them. He climbed an unmapped mountain range with 2 companions using nothing but a carpenter's adze and rope made of salvaged wire. And at the end of it, after 700 days, all 27 men were alive. Marcus Aurelius understood something that most men spend their lives running from. The obstacle is not interrupting your path. It is revealing it. Every time life blocks one direction, it is quietly showing you another. The question is whether you have the discipline to stop cursing the wall and start looking for the door. Think about what you are facing right now. The job that didn't come through. The relationship that ended. The plan that collapsed. Now ask yourself honestly, what is the obstacle actually showing you? What strength is it demanding that you develop? What direction is it forcing you to consider that you would never have chosen on your own? The fire that burns a forest creates the conditions for new growth. The Stoics believed this not as a comfort but as a strategy. Look at your obstacle long enough, and you will see the way through it. And when you get to the other side, you will not just be past it. You will be stronger for having gone through it. Waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be. Be one. There is a story told about Theodore Roosevelt that captures this quote with perfect precision. In 1884, within the span of 2 days, Roosevelt lost both his mother and his wife. He was 25 years old. He wrote a single large X in his diary that night, with 4 words beneath it. The light has gone out. Then he closed the journal, left New York, and went to the Dakota Badlands. He did not write a book about grief. He did not give lectures on resilience. He did not hold salons where he explained to others how a man should handle tragedy. He put on rough clothes, rode hard horses, branded cattle, chased outlaws, and worked himself until his hands bled and his body gave out at the end of each day. He built himself back not through words but through action. 2 years later he returned to New York. He was not the same man. He was harder, quieter, and strangely more alive than he had been before. The grief had not left him. He had just refused to let it define him. Marcus Aurelius grew up surrounded by philosophers. He was trained by the greatest Stoic teachers of his age. He had access to every argument about virtue, every debate about what constituted a good life. And the conclusion he kept returning to was this: the arguing is not the work. The being is the work. We live in an age of endless discourse about what masculinity should look like, what strength should mean, what a man is supposed to be. The internet is full of men debating these questions while not doing the actual thing. Being patient with the people who test them. Being honest when lying would be easier. Showing up when they would rather disappear. Marcus Aurelius had no patience for the performance of virtue. He wanted the substance of it. And the substance of it is always the same, not what you say about it, but what you do when it costs you something. Very little is needed to make a happy life. It is all within yourself, in your way of thinking. In 1972, a Vietnamese monk named Thich Nhat Hanh arrived in the United States carrying essentially nothing. He had been exiled from his homeland for refusing to take sides in the war, too peaceful for the communists, too resistant for the government. He had lost his monastery, his community, and any safe place to return to. He was, by every external measure, a man who had been stripped of everything. He rented a farmhouse in rural France. He planted a garden. He started a small community of like-minded practitioners. He wrote. He walked slowly through the fields every morning, paying attention to exactly one thing at a time. And from that simplicity, from what most people would recognize as deprivation, he built one of the most influential spiritual movements of the 20th century. He was not happy despite his circumstances. He had simply never agreed to let his circumstances determine his happiness. Marcus Aurelius wrote this quote while ruling the most extravagant empire the ancient world had ever seen. He was surrounded by gold, by slaves, by banquets, by spectacle. And he wrote in his private journal that almost none of it was necessary. That the architecture of a good life was built inside, not outside. We are sold the opposite idea every day. That the apartment upgrade will do it. The car, the salary, the relationship, the body, and then you will finally arrive at the version of yourself that is content. But every man who has chased those things and caught them knows the secret. Catching them does not solve the inner problem. It only resets the scoreboard. The Stoics were not against success. They were not against wealth or achievement. They were against the belief that those things were the source of anything real. A man who can sit alone in a quiet room with nothing and still feels solid, that man cannot be threatened. That man cannot be manipulated. That man cannot be broken by loss, because his foundation was never built on what he had. The first rule is to keep an untroubled spirit. The second is to look things in the face and know them for what they are. When John McCain's plane was shot down over Hanoi in October 1967, he broke both arms and his right knee on ejection, was bayoneted by a North Vietnamese soldier in the groin, and nearly drowned before being dragged from a lake. He spent the next 5.5 years as a prisoner of war. For 2 of those years, he was held in solitary confinement. He was offered early release, because his father was an admiral, and the Vietnamese believed his release would be a propaganda victory. He refused. He said he would not leave before the men who had been there longer than him. The punishment for that refusal was severe. He was beaten regularly. He was denied medical care. He spent months in a cell barely large enough to turn around in. What kept him intact, he said later, was not rage and not hope in the naive sense, not a belief that everything would be fine. It was something closer to clarity. He looked at his situation without flinching. He accepted it for what it was. And from that acceptance, from that refusal to dress the reality in either false optimism or despair, he found the stillness he needed to endure. Marcus Aurelius built his entire inner life on this 2-part practice. First, keep the spirit calm, not passive, not unfeeling, but untroubled at the core. Second, see reality for what it actually is. Not what you wish it were. Not what frightens you it might become. What it actually is right now, in this moment. Most men's suffering comes not from their actual circumstances, but from the story they layer on top of their circumstances. They do not just lose a job, they construct an elaborate narrative about what that loss means about their worth, their future, their identity. They do not just have a hard conversation, they rehearse every possible outcome until they have exhausted themselves on scenarios that may never happen. The calm spirit and the clear eye work together. When you are not disturbed inside, you can see more clearly. When you see more clearly, you are less disturbed inside. This is not a technique. It is a way of being, one that has to be chosen, again and again, every time the noise begins. If someone is able to show me that what I think or do is not right, I will happily change. In 1847, a Hungarian physician named Ignaz Semmelweis discovered something that should have changed medicine forever. He noticed that the maternity ward run by medical students had a death rate 5 times higher than the one run by midwives. After months of investigation, he identified the cause. The medical students were going directly from performing autopsies to delivering babies, without washing their hands. He introduced mandatory hand-washing and the death rate dropped by 90% almost immediately. The medical establishment refused to accept it. Not because the evidence was weak, the evidence was overwhelming. They refused because acceptance would have meant acknowledging that they had been killing patients for years. Their ego could not survive the truth. Semmelweis was dismissed, ridiculed, eventually committed to a mental asylum, where he died 2 weeks later, ironically, from an infection. Thousands of women continued to die unnecessarily for 30 more years before germ theory was accepted. That is what pride costs. Not abstract pride, the specific pride that refuses to be wrong. Marcus Aurelius, the most powerful man in the world, wrote in his private journal that if someone could show him his thinking was mistaken, he would gladly correct it. That he was grateful for the correction. That the goal was not to be right, the goal was to be aligned with truth. This is one of the most underrated forms of strength. The man who cannot be corrected is the man whose growth has an invisible ceiling. He will improve up to the edge of his current beliefs and then stop, because any evidence that pushes past that edge feels like an attack on who he is. The truly strong man separates his identity from his opinions. His opinions can be wrong. He can update them. His character, the commitment to truth, to growth, to getting it right, that does not change. That is the anchor. Everything else is adjustable. If this channel has ever made you think differently about something, subscribe to Inner Steel and keep coming back. That willingness to engage seriously with ideas is exactly what this work is for. Do not indulge in dreams of what you do not have, but reckon up the chief of the blessings you do have. In the winter of 1944, a young American soldier named Louis Zamperini was drifting on a small rubber raft somewhere in the Pacific Ocean. He had survived a plane crash. He had no food, no radio, no motor. Sharks circled beneath the raft. The sun burned overhead by day. The cold came at night. He had been there for days already, and had no way of knowing how many more days would come. He would eventually drift for 47 days, the longest known survival at sea at the time, before being captured by the Japanese Navy and taken to a series of POW camps, where he endured abuse that would have destroyed almost any man. But something that people who study his survival consistently note is what he focused on during those 47 days on the raft. He focused on what was still there. The water they could collect from rain. The fish they could catch. The fact that the raft had not capsized. The fact that he was still breathing. Not in a delusional way. He was not pretending the situation was fine. He was rationing his mental energy. And the way he rationed it was by refusing to spend it on what was absent. Marcus Aurelius practiced a Stoic exercise called negative visualization, imagining the loss of what you have in order to restore your appreciation of it. But this quote cuts even more directly. Stop dreaming about what you lack. Take inventory of what you have. This is not positivity thinking. It is strategic clarity. The man who is always oriented toward what he doesn't yet have cannot feel the ground beneath his feet. He is always somewhere else, in the future, in the fantasy, in the comparison. And a man who is always somewhere else cannot act effectively where he actually is. Look at your life tonight. Not the life you want. Not the life you're afraid you'll never have. The life that is actually here, the people in it, the abilities you've built, the experiences that have made you who you are. That inventory is more substantial than your disappointment usually allows you to see. The object of life is not to be on the side of the majority, but to escape finding oneself in the ranks of the insane. In 1846, the poet Henry David Thoreau was arrested for refusing to pay a poll tax that he believed supported the institution of slavery and the Mexican-American War. He spent a night in the Concord jail. His friend Ralph Waldo Emerson came to the window and asked famously, "Henry, what are you doing in there?" Thoreau replied, "Ralph, what are you doing out there?" The majority of his neighbors paid the tax without a second thought. Not because they believed in what it funded. Because they did not want the inconvenience of refusal. Because belonging to the crowd is always the path of least resistance. Because consensus feels like safety even when it is moving in a deeply wrong direction. Thoreau wrote about this night in an essay that would influence Gandhi, who would influence Martin Luther King, who would reshape the civil rights movement in America. One man's refusal to follow the majority, which most people dismissed as eccentric stubbornness, rippled forward through generations. Marcus Aurelius was surrounded by sycophants. He was the emperor. Everyone around him had a professional incentive to agree with him. He had to actively work against the natural pull of consensus. He had to keep asking himself, is this the correct position, or is this the position that everyone around me happens to hold? The insanity he is referring to is not madness in the clinical sense. It is the insanity of following a crowd off a cliff because no one wants to be the one to say they see the edge. It is the insanity of suppressing what you know to be true because the social cost of speaking it feels too high. It is the insanity of becoming a stranger to yourself in order to remain comfortable with strangers. The Stoic man does not chase originality for its own sake. But he does refuse to outsource his judgment. He thinks. He checks. He asks himself whether his position was arrived at through reasoning or through proximity. And when the crowd moves in a direction his reason rejects, he stops moving. Receive without pride, relinquish without struggle. In the autumn of 1973, a Danish sailor named Stig Severinsen's father died suddenly. Stig was in his 20s. His father had been his hero, his compass, his model for what a man could be. The grief was enormous. He had no template for surviving it. He did not become bitter. He did not rage against the unfairness of it. He sat with it. He allowed it to be what it was, a loss, real and irreversible. And from that loss, he quietly redirected. He became one of the world's foremost experts on breathing, on the relationship between breath control and inner calm, and he has taught thousands of people how to find stillness in the middle of their worst moments. The very skill forged by the discipline of surviving grief became the gift he gave to others. Marcus Aurelius lost children. He lost friends. He lost mentors. He lost the early version of the empire he had hoped to leave behind. And what he wrote in his journal, again and again, was this: receive what comes with openness. Release what goes without clinging. The pride in receiving is the belief that good things are owed to you, that success, love, health, and comfort are your natural state and anything less is an injustice. The struggle in relinquishing is the refusal to accept that things which came must also go. Both are forms of the same error, treating the temporary as if it were permanent. Everything you have right now, your health, your relationships, your work, your clarity, is on loan. This is not a morbid thought. It is a liberating one. When you hold things loosely enough to lose them, you hold them more honestly. You appreciate them in real time rather than only after they are gone. The man who has truly absorbed this quote is undefeatable, not because nothing can be taken from him, but because nothing taken from him can define him. He was whole before it arrived. He is whole after it leaves. You could leave life right now. Let that determine what you do and say and think. In 1991, Randy Pausch was an ordinary computer science professor at Carnegie Mellon University. He was funny, dedicated, technically brilliant, beloved by his students. In September 2006, at the age of 45, he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. He was given 6 months to live. The university had a tradition of professors delivering one final lecture, a hypothetical talk in which they were asked to consider what wisdom they would share if it were truly their last. For Randy Pausch, it was not hypothetical. He delivered his last lecture in September 2007, 6 months before he died, with his cancer already visible on a medical scan that he showed the audience at the opening. He was not morbid. He was radiant. Because the knowledge of his mortality had stripped away every trivial concern and left only what was real. He spent his remaining months not preparing to die but choosing with absolute intentionality how to live. He said yes to everything that mattered and no to everything that didn't, without guilt, without apology, without the social performance that consumes so much ordinary life. Marcus Aurelius returned to this theme more than any other in the Meditations. He was not obsessed with death as a morbid preoccupation. He used it as a clarifying lens. When you hold the possibility of your own ending clearly in your mind, it becomes very difficult to spend the afternoon doing things that don't matter. It becomes very difficult to have a conversation you don't mean, to stay in a situation you know is wrong, to postpone a decision that has already been made in your heart. This is not pessimism. This is the most serious form of optimism, taking the time you have seriously enough to spend it on what is actually real. Ask yourself tonight, if this were the last version of you, if this were the last day you had to be the man you are trying to become, what would you do differently tomorrow morning? What would you stop tolerating? What would you finally begin? When you wake up in the morning, tell yourself, the people I deal with today will be meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous, and surly. This quote is the one that surprises people the most. They expect the emperor philosopher to begin his day with some kind of elevated affirmation, some vision of human goodness. Instead, he begins his day with what sounds almost like a warning. But read the second half of what he wrote. They are like this because they cannot tell good from evil. But I have seen the beauty of good, and the ugliness of evil, and have recognized that the wrongdoer has a nature related to my own, not of the same blood or birth, but the same mind, and possessing a share of the divine. And so none of them can hurt me. In 2003, Nelson Mandela gave a public address in which someone asked him how he dealt with bitterness toward his captors, the men who had imprisoned him for 27 years, who had stripped him of his freedom during what should have been the most productive decades of his life. He said quietly that when he walked out of prison he realized that if he continued to hate them, he would still be their prisoner. He had chosen, deliberately and at great personal cost, to understand them as men who had been shaped by ignorance and fear, not because they deserved that understanding, but because he deserved to be free of the hatred. Marcus Aurelius was not being cynical when he began his day with that warning. He was being strategic. He was preloading his patience. He was reminding himself that the difficult, petty, dishonest, small-minded people he would encounter that day were not acting from evil, they were acting from ignorance. And ignorance, unlike evil, can be met with understanding instead of rage. This is perhaps the most practical Stoic teaching of all. The people who will test you today are not your enemies. They are just people, shaped by wounds you cannot see, operating from a narrowness they may never overcome. You are not required to fix them. You are not required to absorb their smallness. You are only required to remain yourself while they are exactly as they are. When someone cuts you off in traffic, they are just a person. When someone belittles your work, they are just a person. When someone is dishonest with you, ungrateful for what you give, arrogant about what they have, they are just people, doing the best they can from within the limits of who they currently are. And you are a man who has decided to be something larger than a reaction. Closing. Marcus Aurelius died in March of the year 180, somewhere near the Danube frontier, still working, still fighting, still writing. He did not die in his palace. He did not die in comfort. He died doing the thing he believed he was supposed to do. What he left behind was not an empire. Empires collapse. What he left behind was a private document written to no one, by a man who was simply trying, every single day, to be the person he was capable of being. 11 quotes. 11 principles. But underneath all of them, the same instruction: begin inside. Control what is yours to control. See clearly. Act honestly. Hold loosely. Show up. The man who lives by these words will not always be the richest man in the room. He will not always be the loudest. He will not always be the most celebrated. But he will be the most real. And in the end, after all the noise has settled and the performances have run out, real is the only thing that holds. If this video reached something in you, if you felt even one of these quotes land somewhere true, then you already understand what Inner Steel is about. This channel exists for men who take the inner work seriously. Subscribe to Inner Steel, share this with someone who needs it, and come back. Because the work continues. Marcus Aurelius said it best, in the final lines of everything. Do not act as if you had 10,000 years to live. The hour is at hand. Make the hour count.